News 2 presents To the Point.
First point, the case of a fired Charleston County deputy could lead to changes at the state level, what it could mean for all government employees with student loans. Second point, election reforms dead in the water. A disagreement over how the board is voted and could mean big changes for all early voting in the state. We'll explain why. And third point, executions on hold right now. We're working to learn how long it could be before a full decision is made on the futures of 2 inmates in South Carolina. Hello and thank you for joining us for To the Point, the show where we break down the political issues and elections that matter to you. And later in the show, our political analyst John Bersini will be in studio with us to give you the in-depth analysis of bills being debated at the local, state, and federal levels. A Low-Country lawmaker introduced a bill that would not let student loans impact state government employees. It comes after Charleston County Chief Deputy Joy Smith was fired because of her, quote, willful default on student loans. Representative Marvin Pendarvis filed a bill that would delete provisions that doesn't allow to default state government employees from their jobs. He says it's important for him to act now on introducing the bill to help people across the state who may be in the same situation as Smith's.
It's having a more detrimental impact on communities and people and their livelihoods than it ever has. And so we have an obligation to make sure that we're taking care of people.
And John Bersini joining us now. John, can you kind of walk me through maybe the history of this law and how it's impacted people in our state?
So student loans are a real thing. It's something that millions of individuals living here in the United States struggle with on a daily basis. Student loans, in particular to the state, have been a focal point, even in screening questions for non-paid commissions and boards. One of the questions they ask, have you ever defaulted on a student loan? A student loan, again, special kind of debt. It's not dischargeable in bankruptcy. It's basically going to stay with you forever. Now, the federal government certainly has some different provisions as far as income-based repayment plans. Some of those provide for forgiveness options. But again, if you don't meet any of those criteria, that debt stays with you forever. If it starts to impact your employment, then there's some questions about, is that really a question of merit? And basically, how do you perform your job?
In this particular case, Sheriff Graziano, know that Joy Smith had student loans outstanding about a year ago. Asked her to get up to date on those to pay those off. Is that year leniency a thing that the state law allows, or do you think the sheriff let this go maybe a little too long before she made the decision to fire Smith?
Well, politics always comes into play, regardless of what the question may be. For a lot of folks, again, not just talking about this particular situation, but a year might not be enough time. Inflation's at an all-time high right now. Goods and services cost more. Housing is more expensive. For a lot of folks that are struggling with student loan debt, just even getting caught up may not be an option. Now, the Biden administration, it looks like there's some new provisions coming out where they are going to provide for some additional relief measures. And when payments, looks like when they restart later this year, they're bringing everyone current. So hypothetically, in this situation, had the deputy been brought current, would this even be an issue right now?
Yeah, certainly an interesting thing we'll have to continue to watch, and especially with Marvin Pendarvis' bill out there, it'll be interesting to see if that changes next year.
Certainly.
Now to a second point update on a story we brought you last week. A state lawmaker had a conversation with Charleston International Airport officials after he says he was the victim of a rental car scam at the airport. Representative Wendell Gilliard says Budget Avis charged him more than $20,000 in damages for a car he says he returned in mint condition. He says he's recently drafted a House bill meant to protect people from rental car scams here in the Palmetto State.
It's not about you, me, it's about the people, your friends, your relatives, the visitors who come to this fine state and city. We have to take action with these car rentals. We cannot allow another day to go by.
Representative Gilliard says he hopes his proposed House bill passes as quickly as possible. A Count on 2 update, you no longer have to wear a mask on most flights at most airports, including Charleston International. This comes after a federal judge's ruling the CDC was overstepping its authority with a mask mandate on public transportation. Masks are now optional on domestic flights for several major airlines. You still have to wear a mask when flying to some places, and that includes some international flights. The Association of Flight Attendants says flight crews will help you as airline policies change.
Passengers should be listening to crew members they will be getting information from the airlines about what the latest policies are and give those instructions, and just understand that there may be some shifting over the next 24 to 48 hours, and understand that from one flight to the next, you might even be given different instructions, but it's still a requirement for you to follow those crew member instructions.
Now, the Justice Department is appealing the ruling. The DOJ and CDC disagree with the judge's decision. Our second point, the future of a bill that would establish early voting in South Carolina is in jeopardy. The Senate passed the bill unanimously, but included some changes House leadership and the governor say they can't sign off on. Our Jason Raven tells us more.
H 4919 passed the House of Representatives unanimously this week, and it would establish a 2-week early voting period in South Carolina and make other changes to the state's election laws.
A vote of 114 to 0.
House Republicans and Democrats all voted in favor to pass a bill that would let you vote Monday through Saturday with no excuse 2 weeks before an election.
No excuse early voting doesn't have a partisan bias. It does not help one party rather than the other.
Now, the early voting push picked up steam after the elections in 2020, when no excuse absentee voting was allowed in South Carolina due to the pandemic. Now, Isaac Kramer with the Charleston County Board of Elections says they saw 75% of voters cast ballots early.
When you expand the opportunity for voters to not just cast their ballot on election day, to just do it early, they're going to do it. And also that's going to reduce the amount of lines we have on election day. And that just makes it a better experience overall.
Now, election workers would also be allowed to open absentee ballots earlier. Now, Kramer says to help meet the changes laid out in the bill, county election offices would also need some additional funding.
It will help the process tremendously when you see these locations fully staffed with very good workers, and it's going to be a good experience for our voters.
Now, the League of Women Voters of South Carolina say their biggest issue with the legislation was added on the House floor. It's a requirement for a 5% audit following an election. They want to see more clarification around that proposal.
They also gave very broad latitude for what kind of audit it would be. And they did not do anything about the unfortunate fact that we have one of the shortest certification deadlines in the nation.
Now, the State Election Commission says they have always supported the concept of no excuse early voting and have never been more optimistic about it happening here in South Carolina since the House voted unanimously to pass the bill. In Columbia, I'm Jason Raven.
We want to bring back in John Bersini. And John, kind of looking at this, the early voting bill was sent back to a House committee this week, and you know that's something you could call it a strange move. Can you kind of break down the latest, and does this maybe kill this bill for this year?
Sure. So that definitely is a real possibility. In a very odd move, the House opted to recommit 4919 to the House Judiciary Committee. Now, to understand the legislative process, the heavy lifting and crafting a lot of these bills is done at the subcommittee and committee level. The fact that they've already worked on this, it went to one chamber, it's now bounced back to concur with amendments done in the other. The fact they're recommitting it, it's something a lot of folks that work in Columbia have never seen before in the House, and it's only happened one other time this year in the state Senate.
You know, if this does effectively kill this bill for this year, you know, what does it mean for next year? Do we see this bill come back up next session, next time? What would you expect there?
So there's going to be a question of how much appetite is there to tackle this again in the General Assembly? It looks like there was really a dividing line that was established this year, and that's the governor and Speaker Lucas basically said they had an issue with the advice and consent clause that the Senate reinstalled in 4919. Majority Leader Massey argues that, you know what, it is just that, advice and consent, but depending on who you talk to around Columbia, there's more to it than that the Senate really wanted the power to fire the executive director of the State Election Commission. Some of this goes back to the drama that we saw with Marcy Andino and her dismissal. Folks in the Senate didn't think that happened fast enough. This was a way that they were trying to take some of that lift on themselves. The governor, Speaker Lucas, disagreed with it. Shots were fired, and we basically find ourselves in the position that we are now. So again, pieces may come back. There are some elements that the State Election Commission certainly would like to see that would help in the counting of some of the absentee and early voting ballots. Again, but for now, that bill's not moving anywhere.
You know, let me ask you this. Obviously, South Carolina is looking at, you know, the governor's race. We're looking at, you know, SC01 here in the Low Country. I mean, was there a push to really get this done ahead of those big elections for South Carolina this year? Is that, you think, an upset?
So there was. We had the state election director, Knapp. We had Charleston County election director. They were in Columbia a lot. They testified on 4919 to a tremendous extent. They really had a lot of input. So the fact that it's not moving, again, outside of the 2 weeks of no excuse early voting, is going to put them in a really tough position.
Be something to continue to watch for us here, in Charleston and throughout the state, John. All right, we're going to move on to our next point. South Carolina lawmakers have introduced a bill that would legalize and regulate sports betting in the state. If passed, most people 21 or older would be able to bet on professional, collegiate, or esports. Some South Carolina politicians estimate legalizing sports betting could generate $40 million at a year in tax revenue. The state Senate and state House are debating different versions of their multi-billion-dollar budget bill. The bill in the Senate is debating $12.6 billion. That's about $1 billion less than the plan the House is debating. The Senate budget would raise the minimum pay for new teachers to $38,000, but the House plan would give a $1,500 one-time bonus to all state employees.
Next on News 2.
Critical race theory, should it be taught in South Carolina schools? Lawmakers debating the controversial teaching method at the State House. Developing news, we're still working to learn when executions will resume after the state Supreme Court issued temporary stays on 2 executions. Richard Moore was scheduled to die by firing squad in Columbia on April 29th. Brad Sigmund was scheduled to die later in May. Now the state's top court has ordered a temporary stay of execution for both Moore's and Sigmund's. Lawyers called the execution methods unconstitutional since lethal injection was the default method at the time of sentencing. Since then, South Carolina has passed a law that lets inmates choose between firing squad or execution as their method of execution. Moore was convicted of killing a convenience store clerk in Spartanburg County in 1999. Moore's attorneys Lindsey Vaughn says this pause is a good outcome for her client in the meantime, but she believes there's still more work yet to be done.
The evidence is clear that he entered into the convenience store without a weapon, which shows that his crime doesn't have the kind of premeditation that raises it to be the worst of the worst, that the death penalty is supposed to be reserved for. And my hope is that this stay order now allows for time for that review to happen.
And John, we first saw Richard Moore's execution get put on a stay. Then we saw Brad Sigmund, I think, about a week later. I mean, what does this mean for the state? Where does this head next? And how long do you expect these stays to last?
So it's a terribly interesting question. A lot of folks believe that this really could reach the United States Supreme Court level. There was an argument when the General Assembly debated putting the firing squad as an option of execution in South Carolina on whether it was constitutional or not. What this really comes down to, and one of the arguments that was basically made on the House floor, had the firing squad been an option when these individuals were convicted, would that have altered their outcome? Would they have been maybe more prone to take a plea deal knowing that lethal injection wasn't an option? And those are questions certainly that we don't know then. Firing squads only used by a handful of states. Certainly there will be an argument on whether that is cruel and unusual. The court certainly could decide that, but this may linger on for a little longer.
John, it brings up a couple questions to mind, and the other thing is, do you think the state will actually carry these out? I mean, as far as the firing squad, executions in South Carolina.
Well, so again, interesting question. So moving forward, that may be more of a likely option. Again, what's being argued right now is firing squad was not even the law at the time these cases were decided. So looking forward, again, that is the law right now in South Carolina. Again, and we can argue what's cruel and unusual. Some folks think that the state should make its own drugs, for example, to bring back lethal injections. Some people think that that's not an option. But right now, they are bound based upon a decision of a jury to these individuals were sentenced to death. It's just a question of when do we get there?
Last question, John. Do you think that this will force South Carolina to look at maybe possible other options when it comes to injection or execution rather in South Carolina?
So again, interesting question. If you look back at some of the debate that occurred in the General Assembly, there were different amendments that were offered up to even bring back things like the guillotine. Now they were voted down. They weren't even given serious consideration. But if lethal injection drugs remain hard to come by, they're going to have to do something to comply with the current law.
Be interesting to continue watching and see how long those stays last. John, thank you. In other news out of the state, House members have wrapped up their debate over critical race theory being taught in schools. Our state reporter Jason Raven has the latest.
Supporters of the legislation say this is another way to keep parents in the know on what's being taught in their child's school and how it's being taught. Meanwhile, critics say passing this sends the wrong message to educators in South Carolina and students. After debating possible changes to the bill for hours Wednesday, the House limited debate to 1 hour in favor and 1 hour against the bill itself Thursday before voting on it.
We are pushing ourselves towards censorship that will lead us to be virtually ignorant in perpetuity.
Now, House Democrats once again voiced their concerns over H. 5183. They say it will make teaching difficult for educators in South Carolina and is unnecessary censorship since critical race theory isn't being taught in South Carolina public schools.
We have a beautiful history in this country, and it has some high points and some low points. And if you take it out, you leave a bland veneer of lies and fiction.
Now, House Education and Public Works Chairwoman Representative Rita Allison was the sole Republican who spoke on the bill Thursday.
Instead, it specifically provides the school can teach the history of ethnic groups as described in our state standards already.
Representative Allison says the bill creates protections for educators who are accused of teaching something they're not supposed to.
The bill prohibits hearsay and groundless accusations and gives teachers and parents and students and administrators an understandable and fair system.
Now, the House voted 73-40 to give the bill second reading. Now, the bill needs a 2/3 vote to be taken up in the Senate since it's past the crossover deadline. In Columbia, I'm Jason Raven.
Next on News 2.
Coming up, the first congressional race is heating up. Congresswoman Nancy Mace facing two key challengers right now, including one in her own party. We'll break it all down, including the race coming up. Welcome back to the Point. The race for South Carolina's first congressional district is heating up. Here's a look at what the candidates have been up to. We spoke with Congresswoman Nancy Mace about her efforts to get students involved in art. It's all part of the Congressional Art Competition, where Low Country students are asked to submit their work that may be on display in the nation's capital. The winning piece of art will be on display in Washington, D.C., and the two runner-ups will be put in Representative Nancy Mace's offices here in the Low Country. A candidate from Mace's own party, Katie Arrington, is gaining support across the state. Congressman Joe Wilson from the Midlands says Arrington is a proven fighter for conservative principles and hopes she will advocate for the military and for veterans. And Dr. Annie Andrews, who is one of the leading Democrats in the race so far, talked about the gun violence this week. The Low Country pediatrician held a virtual conversation with a parent who lost his daughter in the school shooting in Parkland, Florida, and a trauma surgeon who focuses on gun violence prevention. And John, we want to talk about this race now. Obviously, it's starting to heat up. The primaries are, just a couple weeks away at this point. So Katie Arrington, Nancy Mace, we have even Linz Piper Loomis to throw another name into that chat. Kind of talk to us about maybe a preview ahead of the primary.
So it's going to get interesting from here. Hard to believe that primary is mid-June, and we're almost there. Right now, the candidates certainly are trying to make their case for voters. It's important to keep in mind primary elections are different than general elections. The voter universe, that the folks that you're trying to court to come over to support you, generally are very party loyalist. A lot of times, on both sides, whether Republicans or Democrats, it's those individuals that have the really extreme party views are the ones that are going to show up and vote. So sometimes you'll see candidates that try to almost overcompensate to win those voters over, where they might take more neutral or more midstream stances leading into a general.
I want to bring up something that happened this past week. Katie Arrington making a point saying, telling Nancy Mace, I'll take a lie detector test when and where you name it, in regards to her DOD accusations that she lost her security clearance. Can you kind of talk to me about, is this something that we're going to can expect to see in the coming weeks between these candidates?
Oh, I think everything is on the table there. I certainly think this race is going to continue to evolve and be very interesting for voters. For folks who like political theater, it doesn't get any better than this. This is really going to be interesting moving forward. Certainly, Representative Mace does have an advantage just being an incumbent. Mm-hmm. We have a tendency in this country to re-elect incumbents. Not always. You can ask former Congressman Joe Cunningham that question. But nevertheless, it's important to keep in mind as well, this is a different 1st Congressional District that they are running in. It's different for Representative Mace. It's different for Katie Arrington, again, who ran against Joe Cunningham a couple of years ago. We're running under the new maps that were just signed into law. So again, the demographics in a general favor Republicans. That probably says as well that the Republican base probably is a little broader, and some of their views might be a little more extreme.
John, we'll keep a close eye on that as we head towards the primary for that race. And of course, thank you so much for joining us for To The Point. We'll be back for News 2 at 6 later this evening, and you can count on 2 to the Point to be back here next Sunday. Have a great weekend.